Okay, we are live. We have Alexander Mercouris with us in London, and we are very happy, very honored to have the one and only Mitch Feierstein. Mitch, how are you doing? Where can people find you? I have the link in the description box down below to your book, Planet Ponzi, your website, your book, as well as your Twitter profile, and I will put your Substack link as well in the description box down below and as a pinned comment. Mitch, is there anywhere else that people can connect with you? Hello, Mitch?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I
Yes.
think I'm getting a lot of feedback. I don't know why it's repeating, but yeah, I mean that's great. I'm glad to be here today. Thanks for having. Yeah, there's a delay as well.
Right. Hello, Alex.
Yes. Okay, let's get rolling because we have Mitch with us for 1 hour. So let's get started. Hello to everyone that is watching us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, and the Duran.locals.com. Hello to all our moderators. Hello, Valley S. I see you in the chat. It's good to have you with us. And let's get started, Alexander. Let's talk Planet Ponzi. We have got Mitch with us. Let's go.
Yes, well, first of all, can I say it is a huge pleasure and a personal pleasure to have Mitch on this program. I've known Mitch a certain while, and I'm going to say this. His book, Planet Ponzi, if you haven't read it, you really do need to read it. It's the single most insightful and important book anybody can read who wants to understand where we are now with the economy and with the financial situation. Just Mitch, if you can just show it to everybody again, so that if they haven't got it, they really do need to read it. And there is so much knowledge and information there. There are also things in it about Britain, which I will say straight away before we proceed. They make me very sad reading it now from when it was written. And Mitch, here you are. You're a person who was there. You're in the markets. You understand the situation. You work in the markets all the time. We're told by Jerome Powell, we're told by Janet Yellen, we're told by all these people that there is no cause concern. Everything is well. All is well. Problems with the banks. They're not systemic. They're just a few isolated banks. Is that really the situation we are in, or are they telling us BS?
I don't believe that's the situation that we're in. I think the financial system is collapsing. I think governments, politicians, the media are all lying to people about everything. We have a bunch of diversions going on right now. You have the dot-com crash, the great financial crisis, COVID, Biden election, potential World War III. One of the greatest economic plunder takes place in the background. Federal Reserve Chairman last week, Powell, came out and said the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient. Within an hour of his end of his speech, two more regional banks in California went bust. So this is just an example of how a lack of leadership and lack of adequate enforcement of existing regulation has caused financial crisis in 2008 and the one that we are about on the precipice of being right now. Counterparty risk contagion to the banking system is a real and present danger. I appeared on a TV show in the United Kingdom and discussed Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank is just the beginning. There's a lot more to come. Many more banks will fail. Because what's happened is over the past decade plus, global central banks have gone on a credit orgy. They've printed trillions of dollars they didn't have out of thin air. Just magic.
So, Mitch, can I interrupt you because the sound isn't as clear as it could be? Alex, do you have any thoughts about this? Because we're not getting Mitch. At least I'm not getting Mitch completely clearly.
Yeah, the sound is coming a little bit garbled.
Yeah, I'm.
Do you have headphones, Mitch, by any chance?
I have headphones I can get. Yeah. Should I go grab them?
Yeah, can you grab them and plug them in? Maybe even if they're these types of
let me try to
headphones. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll be here. We'll be here.
Wait 1 second.
Alexander, what were your thoughts on the Victory Day?
Oh, well, I've done a very comprehensive program about this for my channel. I've done a detailed analysis of Putin's speech. It's a very, very interesting speech. He covered a lot of ground. He covered the Second World War. He brought points into his speech, which covered both the Second World War and the conflict today. He conflated them very, very interestingly. He also echoed it. He echoed speeches that were made at the time with some of the language that he used today. And I've discussed it at length. So if you want to actually get a comprehensive idea of my thoughts about this, about Putin's speech on Victory Day, you can see it fairly shortly in the video that's coming. It's one of the most interesting speeches Putin has given, in my opinion. And given that he only spoke for about 10 minutes, he packed an awful lot into a very little space. Hello, Mitch.
Can you hear us, Mitch?
Can you hear us?
Okay, we're not getting sound. We're not getting audio.
Sound. Yeah. Yes, we're not hearing you, Mitch. Okay.
So let's get the audio. Yeah.
Get the audio. So that's it was a very, very interesting speech. And of course, if you're going to the media here in the West, I mean, they're just not reporting it at all. I'm not even sure that they fully understood how complex and deep it was, given that, as I said, it was only for 10 minutes.
Yeah. Well, the talk is that Russia only showed one tank, and so that means that they've run out of weapons.
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
we can hear you clearly. That's excellent. Now it's perfect. That's excellent.
Great.
Mitch, pick up. Just start from the beginning. Start from the beginning.
Yes,
I think the audio is really good now.
Good.
Yeah, I turned the volume up. I just have the problem is we have a little bit of an echo, so there's a time delay of about 10 seconds. So I hear myself 10 seconds behind. As I said, the financial system's collapsing. The governments, politicians, bankers, and the media seem to be lying to people about everything. And everything's a crisis. The dot-com crisis was followed by the great financial crisis, followed by COVID, which was a crisis. And then we had Biden's World War III with Ukraine. And this is all a disguise to hide the greatest economic plunder that has taken place in history. Now, what's caused the banking crisis that's coming now with Silicon Valley Bank and the other banks, regional banks in the United States? Two things: lack of leadership and lack of enforcement of existing regulations. It's a failure, a major failure for them to understand counterparty risk and contagion and risk management. We had a operation and an account. We had an investment, actually, private equity investment in a Silicon Valley tech company that was Storia. It was a reasonable amount of money that we had in Silicon Valley Bank. And unfortunately, with several of the meetings I had with them, they were less than impressive. They were unable to make international payments, which were basically as simple as you can get with international banking. I had 8 people on the call, which is unnecessary to have. You could have had a couple of people. We closed our accounts at Silicon Valley Bank in 2017 because I think they're the most incompetent institution I've ever dealt with in my 43 years on Wall Street, the city of London, and working in Tokyo in global investment finance. So as Alexander was saying when I came on, that the Federal Reserve Chairman Powell made a little bit of rumblings when he spoke last week after they raised interest rates to 5.25. He said, the banking system in the United States is sound and resilient. And within 2 hours, 2 banks, regional banks, failed after he went off air. So, I mean, it's just another example of, one of the worst people on the planet is a woman named Janet Yellen. I don't know if you know the history of Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen, the most incompetent person in the world. 20 years in the Federal Reserve banking system, never got anything right. inflation is transitory, inflation is transitory, inflation is transitory. Oh, I lied. Sorry. So, what happens? She gets promoted to become the Treasury Secretary by Biden. The more things you can get wrong and the more incompetent you are, the more upward you get promoted, right? And that's the way that it goes in America now. And I don't know how this ends, but I think it ends really badly. I mean, the regional bank crisis will spread throughout the world, because if the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. That's the way that it works. And I think the next crisis is going to be a crisis of liquidity, because right now we're starting to see a liquidity crisis, while in the background we have the most significant cost of living crisis and inflation that we've ever seen. And as we have the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the ONS, all of these institutions are lying about inflation, because in the United Kingdom, for example, if they had to list the real numbers of inflation, they'd be bankrupt with all this entitlement programs that they have to pay. That's why people who are receiving universal credit, they have a bunch of children, and so they get more payout. They have to suppress the inflation rate, because if they had to pay the true inflation rate, it would blow up the already too high debt, and it would make repaying the debt impossible, because the debt service, the interest on the existing debt, would be impossible to pay given the revenue streams coming in. That's why taxes have to go up in the United Kingdom. They have no choice but to raise taxes on everything and everybody. And this is a real problem, because we're in a recession and people aren't making enough money. And the real rate of inflation in the United Kingdom is probably around 20%. And they're grossly understating what it is. We've had the highest rise in food costs that we've ever had in UK history, or 55 years, they say, but it is actually the highest in history. And, the media is totally dishonest. There's no such thing as fake news. It's actually outright dishonesty is what it is. Because what happens is you have political activists that are running the media right now, rather than journalists that report two sides of a story and allowing the people to decide. And it's really unfortunate. And my voice gets canceled. I had a bunch of followers on Twitter, but when the woke people were running the room, they deleted like 50,000. I got taken off LinkedIn. I had 50,000 followers on LinkedIn, and one day I went on, my profile was gone. It just don't exist anymore. It doesn't really matter because I'm on Google, so whatever. So there you go. You get canceled. It doesn't matter. I don't really care. I think it's all good fun, but I think there are real problems, and we've got to go back and we've got to look at how we got to where we are right now, and what caused the issues. And this is all identity politics, ESG, and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, this all happened when Obama came in and he said he was going to change America forever. And he really did. He changed America, and it's more like cultural Marxism now. I mean, if you think about what's going on and the platforms that they're running, they want to have a distribution of income. You've got a guy in the White House, no matter what you think of the election, Biden's election. I mean, you've got a guy who's incontinent. He wears diapers. He can't speak a sentence. He doesn't get anything right. He's a gaffe machine. He's incredibly can't even have a news conference. So what do we have? We don't know who's really running things in Washington, and that's kind of a problem. And his soundbite now is he wants to finish things off. That's his soundbite. Finish things off. I'm not sure what he wants to finish off. Finish America off. It's like, and the mantra of build back better or get Brexit done. I mean, the problem with all the politicians is they're coordinated on the same page, and somehow the build back better mantra came from. If you look and think about who did that, I'm not sure, but you saw Boris Johnson, you saw Prince Harry, you saw KC3, King Charles III, that is KC3. You had everybody, the host of people. Look on my Twitter feed and you'll see that video. It's absolutely insane what's going on. And so how do we get out of that? People need to get angry and unify and say, look, I'm not going to tolerate this anymore because I know that I can't feed my family. I know inflation's higher than people are reporting it is. Wages are going down. And we're not even talking about the property bubble in residential property and commercial property that the banks are on the hook for. Because when you have a 5%, we've got interest rates have gone up 5% basically from flat zero or negative interest rates. Real negative interest rates were zero. Everybody who has ARMs, adjustable rate mortgages, and there's not just residential properties that have that. You've got commercial people who have those exposures as well. So the commercial exposures are going to be reset in a couple months. You're going to see a massive wave of defaults, and the banks are going to be on the hook. And people are putting their heads in the sand and making believe, oh no, everything's fine, nothing's going to happen. And they blame Liz Truss for the decline in sterling. Now sterling is up at 126 today, which is ridiculous. It's grossly overvalued. So I don't know why we're up at 126, but I think we're going to see a decline in sterling. I think that all global markets are going to reset. But I think what we're looking at in the world now is a unipolar world going into a multipolar world. And the U.S. has always been the rules-based order, and you're going to listen to us or you're going to be canceled or we're going to declare war on your country and we're going to depose you. And now I'd say over 85% of the world population is against that. So, the sanctions that are going on are boomeranging on the West. And the false narratives about Ukraine are just ridiculous. Ukraine is just another money laundering scheme Ukraine has zero path to victory. And a lot of my stuff has been canceled and censored heavily because all of the information, if you mention Ukraine or put it in a tweet, what happens is the Ukrainian intelligence agencies have contacted everybody in the world and said anything has to be considered disinformation, misinformation, or fake news, anything that they don't like. So you consider anything that doesn't come from our office to be fake news. Now, this is not democracy. We need to, we are free people. We should have our sovereignty. The king should guarantee our sovereignty. Everybody should we're sovereign individuals. That's why we left the European Union, right? We should have a choice in something, but we don't. And these are some of the issues we can flesh out in the next hour.
Mitch, you've covered a huge amount of ground. Let me first of all begin by saying that your points about inflation in Britain are absolutely correct. Now, I've just been doing a very crude calculation of food bills. Basically on my own food bills, I'd say I'm paying about 17% more on the food I'm buying this year than I was last year. That's a rough calculation, and that's in Britain. And of course, I would also add that something very unusual is happening in Britain at the moment, which is that we're actually starting to register shortages. Something is very unusual, but very much symptomatic of inflation. You're starting to see empty shelves in some food shops, certainly in my part of North London. And that's because there's disruptions in the supply system, which are very much a product of inflation. But Mitch, let's be specific. What is causing the inflation? Why do we have inflation at the moment in Britain? Why do we have it in the United States? Why is it a worldwide problem? And before you continue, you said that if you are incompetent in the United States, you just go on rising, and that's how Janet Yellen is now Treasury Secretary, having been head of the Federal Reserve. In Europe, let me assure you, it is absolutely no different. We've commented about this many times with Christine Lagarde, and of course in Britain with the Bank of England, it's pretty much the same. But specifically on inflation, what is causing the inflation?
Well, Christine Lagarde, for example, you mentioned, the head of the European Central Bank. We have to discuss her because everything wouldn't be fair unless we did discuss her. She actually was a mediocre lawyer at Baker McKinsey in Chicago before Sarkozy called her back to France, and then she cooked up that deal where Bernard Tapie was paid 400 million euros or 450 million euros from the French banks, which eventually led to an indictment against her, a criminal indictment, and she was convicted of criminal negligence. while she was heading the IMF, it's shocking that the head of the IMF would be convicted in France of criminal negligence. And so what happened? She was promoted to run the ECB. So that's worse than Yellen. I mean, so you promote a criminal to run the central bank, and what could possibly go wrong? I mean, seriously? I mean, so whatever. So and I can go on and on about each character from the central banks and tell you something about each of them. But that's not. You want to talk about the inflation story. So in 2020, January, I think it was, before they had the lockdowns, I did a TV program and talked about the decimated supply chains and the problem with supply chains and why it was going to cause a crisis. And people said, "Oh no, the supply chains are going to be fine. There's not going to be a problem." What happened when in the 80s and 90s is that even the early 2000s, people decided to outsource everything to other countries. I don't know if you know this, but as a fact, most of the antibiotics or the inner ingredients, the chemicals that are used to make antibiotics and a lot of other pharmaceuticals are now manufactured in China. A lot of things are manufactured outside of our countries, and it's a matter of national security that none of this stuff should be. It's because we have a lack of leadership. It comes back to lack of leadership and a lack of regulatory regulations, enforcement of the existing regulations, and these guys are never held to account. And there are lots of interesting questions that are raised. I mean, especially all the money that Biden took from Ukraine and the Biden family took from Ukraine and why it was covered up. I mean, you have the corruption with Sam Bankman fraud and Bitcoin. It was the biggest contributor to the 2020 elections. He stole $10 billion in customer money, and nobody's in jail yet. Nobody's in jail for that. And the other one, who is the woman? Elizabeth Holmes, who was a friend of the Clintons, and she didn't go to jail either. She's changed her name to Liz, not Elizabeth Holmes anymore. Now I'm a mommy at home, so you can't put me in prison, even though I stole $6 billion. So on the inflation note, they're not held accountable. On the crime note, there's a dual justice system. And the problem with this is people aren't being treated equally. So they've abandoned due process and they've abandoned the rule of law. So they've abandoned everything, and they just keep telling people lies, and they gaslight the public. And what they do is they create fear amongst the public, and they make people fearful and throw so many things at them. Climate emergency, COVID, credit crisis, Ukraine, Putin, and people go, oh my God, I want authoritarianism. I'll do anything. I'll accept this nonsense. I mean, if you think about the money flows, I mean, I still can't understand why Washington paid Boris Johnson over $5 million in speeches when I would say 90% of the people in America don't even know who he is. It's kind of crazy that happens. And so let me think about that from a financial perspective. The military-industrial complex can make $2 trillion selling weapons to Europe, and giving him 5 to 10 or 20 million to do that, to keep that war perpetuated that Ukraine can't win, is it. But getting back to the inflation track, so supply chains were already on the precipice, and you have to make each country independent. And what we need to do is get back to restoring supply chains between the different countries, and the tariffs and us leaving the the EU is probably the best thing that could have happened to Britain. But inflation will go higher. Inflation will go higher because I think energy prices are artificially low, which is indicating that we're probably going to be in a recession, or a recession is coming very shortly. But that's not going to help people out because there's going to be a shortage of raw materials to make, like fertilizers to grow foods, and a shortage of natural gas and a shortage of oil, because the UK is basically in energy poverty, 25% of the country, and that's only going to get worse because we're only seeing a temporary respite in oil prices and natural gas prices right now.
Yeah, and you're somebody who has a particular knowledge of energy issues. I think I should just make that point. It's an area where you are directly engaged. So it's a problem of supply chains and also a problem of overspending. I mean, is that what I understand, that you have, in effect, fractured supply chains? Because supply chains have been globalized, but that means that there's no real control over them, and they're fractured and they're easily fragmented. And at the same time, we're spending, governments have been spending too much. Is this correct? Is this my, a sort of analysis that I'm trying to make?
Well, what happens? I think one of the impacts of inflation, you have wage inflation, but what's happened in the West is the West has exported their inflation to the smaller economies that have debt denominated in U.S. dollars, and that's why those countries are struggling even more than the G7 countries. So when you have a payments problem like that, when your debt is denominated in U.S. dollars and your local currency collapses, your debt you still have to pay that debt back. So this creates further disparities in the supply chain because it's an international, like I was saying, it's a multipolar world now. It's not a unipolar world. So that mucks everything up. And so, people aren't making enough to survive. And that's the big problem. And once the input costs go up, because if you think transport costs for food are humongous, they're so much higher than they were, and that's another input cost. If you add up all the input costs for everything for that's done in production, that's part of the supply chain issue, and that's not going to get better anytime soon.
Indeed. Now, governments, central banks tell us that they're going to get inflation under control because they're raising interest rates. Now, is this a good idea to raise interest rates, given that we have such high debt levels? And will the interest rates bring inflation under control?
Well, it's like here, the situation is that the horses all bolted from the barn, and now the central banks want to fix the fence. So the horses are gone already. I mean, that ship has sailed. And the real issue with control, I don't know if you remember Paul Volcker when he was running the Federal Reserve.
Very well.
But Paul Volcker actually, he said, I mean, I remember very well. Paul was probably one of the guys who reined in inflation. He said that the interest rates have to be the rate of inflation to contain inflation. And that's what he did. And it was painful for a lot of people, and it was painful for the politicians, but he reined inflation in. But you have to understand what they did. We need to hold the people to account who caused this problem. The central banks had negative interest rates for 10 years. I mean, think about it. You had Janet Yellen, who was always saying that she was going to have lift off and raise rates. And then you had Mark Carney, who said that he was gonna raise interest rates. How many times did he say that? He created the biggest housing. He was ex Goldman Sachs, and then he ran the Bank of Canada, and then he came over to inflate the housing bubble in the United Kingdom. And then he said, I'm gonna raise interest rates. I'm gonna raise interest rates. And he never raised interest rates. He actually lowered interest rates. And George Osborne, in conjunction, George Osborne hired him and paid him a fortune to destroy our economy. And what he did was he inflated, with George Osborne, the UK property markets to these ridiculous nosebleed levels that we're at now. And the valuations of every asset class are grotesque. We have grotesque asset valuations, which is hyperinflation in selected asset classes. So the housing markets are grotesquely inflated, which means we're going to have a crisis. Because since the beginning of time, and I argue this in my book, that there's got to be a correlation between housing prices and incomes. And they became detached when they started negative interest rates and lending 110% of a loan to value on properties. Properties went from 100,000 to 2 million in 10 years. I mean, come on. People's wages didn't keep track with that, but that's the problem right there, is they've inflated certain asset classes. And stocks. Let's talk about stocks, which is another Ponzi scheme for a minute. Like, the head of Google paid himself $223 million last year. So how did they do that? Are they making more profits? Well, let's see. What are they doing? 80 or $90 billion worth of stock buybacks. So think about that. stock buybacks aren't profitable for many people. They're firing 12,000 employees, but he got paid and all the executives got paid because they get paid if the stocks go up. So the company keeps buying stocks, right? So it gives the illusion that they're making more money than they're making, and it hurts the economy, and they sack people and downsize. The same thing happened to Apple. I don't know that these guys are creating value by 80 billion or $90 billion worth of stock buybacks. And then the share price goes up, and then they pay themselves a huge bonus. Well, look what I did. You didn't create new jobs, and you didn't create value for the company. All you did was pulled forward earnings to today and cashed the executive suite out. So these are all problems. Stock buybacks used to be illegal, and they should be illegal now. And it's a big part of the problem that's inflated the NASDAQ. I mean, so many stocks right now are at nosebleed levels that it's just not sustainable any longer. That's why a credit crisis is inevitable now. And I predicted it would happen as the basis of printing all this money in 2008, and I think it's going to happen within the next few years because we're about to hit a brick wall.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to discuss that because this business about changing regulations. You spoke about a lack of enforcement. By the way, I completely agree with this. I mean, this is something that even I, who have never really worked in markets, but I was on the fringe of things at one time. I mean, I could see the way in which regulations were being watered down or changed or being increasingly not enforced at the very same time that central banks began to feel that they'd got inflation under control in the 1980s, and they simply kept putting their foot down on the monetary accelerator. So you had a strange situation from about, I put it about 1987, around then, when there was that, you remember that stock market crash, where you start to see the enforcement erode.
Absolutely, I was there that day.
Absolutely, accelerator. I was absolutely there. I remember it vividly, and that's always been the solution. Whenever there's a problem, you do the two things: you enforce less, you print more, and it's not a new thing. And it's, in my opinion, it's completely distorted practically everything that's going on in the economy. It's very difficult now, much more difficult than it used to be, to understand what's going on in any economy at the present time. And that is, for me, the point where prices of certain assets began to get completely out of control.
Well, yeah, I think that what we saw, you're talking about when we had Alan Greenspan, who was nicknamed the Maestro. Yeah, he was the Maestro, all right. He was operating the fiddle while the Titanic was sinking, while he was printing money in the background. That's the problem. And so these guys were never held to account. And the problem we have is all we learned was Control Alt P, keep printing, and Powell was like, bzz. The problem, it worked for a while, and it's just not going to work anymore because now we're going to have inflation. And the reason why I wrote Planet Ponzi, the book, is because I told them that they needed to let these banks fail back in 2008. You can't bail them out. And if you do bail them out, what you're going to do is you're going to implode the entire banking system at some point in the future, because all you're doing is creating a bigger mess. They don't resolve the problem. Now, listen, there was Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and a couple other Fed people I can't remember on the stage. And this was epic because they did the Senate investigation into what caused the credit crisis. And Alan Greenspan, I'll never remember the glares he was getting from Ben Bernanke and the other bankers that they wanted to kill him. He said, "I want to tell you something, that we don't need Dodd-Frank and a host of new regulations. Fraud was committed during the credit crisis, and we need enforcement of existing regulations, not new regulations." And so, that's the guy who was watching it happen, the fraud in real time, but they've never done anything. But this is this is what the loggerhead, when I say there's a lack of leadership and a lack of accountability and a lack of enforcement of existing regulations. The regulators in California are incompetent. Silicon Valley Bank, as I told you, I did business with it, and I saw it miles away, and I went on a program in the UK and discussed Silicon Valley Bank the day before it went bust. And I said the problem is lack of leadership and a lack of regulatory authority over that bank. And last week, I think the Federal Reserve examiners came out and said, "Oh, the reason was lack of leadership at the bank and lack of regulatory authority." And I'm like, "Okay, great. You're behind the curve yet once again, but nobody wants to listen to what I have to say." But you see, if you speak sense or speak truth to power, you get censored. I told you, like, they disappeared 50,000 of my followers on Twitter, and they just censor or shadow ban my articles. And, it just gets to be a really difficult time.
Absolutely. So let's move on. So, because you wrote Planet Ponzi, I think, shortly after the 2008 crisis, and perhaps can you explain to people what a Ponzi scheme is exactly? Because, of course, I know what it is, and the person called Ponzi is basically you put money in, you have to constantly attract money to keep essentially your fraud running, and essentially that is what your book said a great part of the financial system had become. It's become a mechanism basically for just bringing in money in order to sustain itself and to grow, very detached from the real economy. And as I said, this is, in my opinion, it began in the late 80s. It got stronger under Greenspan, time when, as I said, Bill Clinton and co was president also. It's important to say that. Bill Clinton starts a lot of the process of dismantling regulations that had existed. But it all came to the fore, or so we thought, in 2008. The banks started to fail. And what happened then? Why weren't the problems sorted out then? What did they actually do?
Well, a Ponzi scheme what it was. The original Ponzi scheme was Charles Ponzi, and what he was doing was borrowing money from people and saying, "I'm going to invest them in stamps in Italy, and then I'm going to pay you this yield." He was not investing it in anything. What he was doing was he was borrowing massive amounts of money and paying back interest, some of them, the new money that was coming in. The reason why I called it Planet Ponzi is because the Ponzi scheme is the government debt. And this is what's going to happen to the US dollar and US dollar hegemony. US dollar is going to collapse. US dollar hegemony. I said this in 1999 on television in a couple of television shows I was on. They said, "What's your prediction for the coming decade?" Because, this was near New Year's Eve, 2020. And I said, look, in the next 10 years, we're going to see the end of US dollar hegemony, and there's going to be a different type of currency that's going to be transacted in, and that's my biggest prediction for the next 10 years. And this is happening now. I mean, now you have India, you have Saudi Arabia. The petrodollar is pretty much finished, and they're trading oil and other commodities that are based out of Eastern Europe and China and the Middle East. They're trading in renminbi, which is the Chinese currency. And so this is part of what's going to happen. The Ponzi scheme that they've got going in the United States, Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. Social Security, I paid my entire life. Every paycheck that I've always had, they took money out. And this is supposed to be like a pension where the government manages it on your behalf, but they've spent that money. That money's gone. And they were counting on more entrants to come in to pay out the older entrants, but they can never do that. And in my book, I discuss this. I discuss all the different pension Ponzi schemes and the Social Security Ponzi scheme and the true nature of the debt. The true nature of the debt. I had an argument with somebody about this today. They said it's 155 trillion. I said, oh no, it's closer to 300 trillion that the United States owes, because they're not including in the 31 trillion that Biden's PR people keep coming out with. They don't include the legally binding obligations that they have to pay, which are Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and the other obligations that they have. Now, Social Security, that's an obligation for them to pay me that. But the younger people in Congress, like that wackadoodle, what's her name, AOC, who thinks you can fly to the sun if you do it at night. She's in Congress. Lunatics they used to put in some insane asylum, but now they're in Congress. So So she thinks that that's an entitlement program or a benefit. It's not a benefit. That's my money that I paid in. So this is just it's like the world is inverted now. It's an actual inversion. We have children being taught that men can get pregnant, right? And that's it's the new normal, and it's everything. It's just gone absolutely manic.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to make a simple observation, which is that, speaking of somebody, I mean, if a currency, money isn't sound, I've said this many times, if it isn't operating coherently, nothing will. It's an inevitable thing, because money is the anchor upon which everything, concrete is based to a great extent. But the point is, and this is something that you brought out very clearly in Planet Ponzi, you have these legal entitlements that stretch into the future. You also have in the United States a collapse in actual discretionary budgeting, because so much of the budget now in the United States is nailed down into programs that you can't really change. It's becoming increasingly difficult, or so it seems to me, to tax, because taxation has to a great extent hit its limits. So what do? First you borrow and then you print. Am I wrong?
Well, no, you're. The problem is you're spot on. But what's happened is the politicians now have seen the magic of the printing press, because they said, "Oh wow, look at these central banks. They just hit Control Alt P. We want Control Alt P, so we'll just spend more money. We'll spend more money too." And they just are spending outrageous amounts of money, and they think that nothing can. What could possibly go wrong is the motto, right? But the issue is, you heard about modern monetary theory, or magic money tree, as I call it. Stephanie Kelton, who is advising Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, and she thought that she came out and said, "Oh yeah, you can print infinite amounts of money." So the politicians actually listened to her, and this is what they've done. They think they can print unlimited amounts of money without consequence, and now what they're going to try to do and we saw the first one in the Bank of Cyprus. That failure was a test balloon. And that was in Euro Money and a couple other magazines. It said, "Oh, it's the safest place to park your money. It's this bust." And that was known as the first bail-in. And now a bail-in is nothing other than a government-sanctioned deposit confiscation. And this is what's coming. And they're going to try to jam the central bank digital currency down your throat, and a social credit system, scoring system like in China. And they're going to be able to see how you spend, what you spend. And if they don't like you, they're just going to shut off your little digital currency, and you're going to starve to death like in China. But this is why our freedoms are being taken away, and people are sleeping at the switch. People need to wake up out there. We can't tolerate this anymore. Enough is enough. We need to take back our freedoms and take back our destiny. Right? The dishonesty has to stop.
I mean, can I just say, Mitch, Alex is in Cyprus, and of course he actually lived through the Cyprus banking crisis very clearly, remembers it very well, as I do. And of course, one of the consequences of what they did with the bail-in, can I just explain the bail-in? People who had their money in the bank found that they were actually having that money taken away from them with the bank, because it was supposed to be part of the bailout of the bank. It was a bizarre thing. Anyway, what it did, and I remember this vividly, is that it took a problem in two banks in Cyprus, and it made it systemic throughout the entire Cypriot banking system, because nobody in their senses, whilst this was going on, wanted.
But that's the contagion I was talking about.
Exactly, it's a contagion. It was a contagious situation. I don't know whether Alex remember. Well, I'm sure he remembers it, but whether he agrees with that analysis. But that was exactly what happened. It was the most crazy thing to do. It totally destroyed overnight the credibility of the system in Cyprus. And I will say this, the Cypriot authorities actually did eventually push back, and eventually that did retrieve the situation, at least to some extent, and has stabilized it since then. But we have this issue. We have printing, money printing. And I want you to discuss whether QE, by the way, is money printing, because I'm reading all sorts of people who are telling me that QE, quantitative easing, is somehow different from money printing. It doesn't really amount to that. But if you can just talk about that in a moment. But we have QE, we have money expansion, we have lack of regulation, we have money going into the banks redistribute it, the banks themselves then become overextended. Is it correct to say that the whole system really relied upon having interest rates at almost zero or below zero, and also money expanding? And now that that's all going into reverse, that's what's causing some of the problems we're seeing in the banking system, in the regional banking system in the United States?
It's causing a lot of the problems in the banking system now. There's systemic rot in the banking system. And, I'm sorry that there's an echo on the line here. That's why I'm having a bit of a problem, and it's difficult for me. I hope people are listening and you can hear what I'm saying. Anyway, so explaining about that, I talked about that and addressed that in my book, that, look, you had interest rates far too low for far too long. And there was a universe, I think, of $17 trillion worth of negative interest rate yielding bonds. Think about that for a minute. So in other words, you had corporates and certain governments that were issuing bonds, holding your money for 10 years, and you pay them to take your money. Think about that. Now, I know a guy who was the head of one of the central banks when I was in my early 20s. And he's based in Eastern Europe, and I stay in touch with him regularly. And I said to him, when I was speaking to him, I said, what would you do if I told you 40 years ago, when interest rates were, I think the 10-year was trading probably around 15%, that one day people are going to be selling bonds with negative yields and people will buy them? And it was like, he said, we would have locked you up in an insane asylum. I mean, it's just ridiculous that they allowed it to get to that point. And that's why we are where we are today. I warn about this in the book. And not only was it a problem in 2008 and 9, but what they've done is accelerated the problem. And a lot of the products, the leverage, debt, credit, and leverage products that they used that created the problems in 2008, they came back and they were bigger and worse than they were then. And some of the derivative products are real problems. Banks like Deutsche Bank and Citibank in America are zombie banks. They don't make profits. I mean, and they're being sustained by the central banks. And, as far as people saying that the money is not money printing, is not QE, I hate to say it, but that's just bullshit.
I agree. I completely agree. That's exactly what I think. I mean, I've seen all kinds of complicated explanations why QE is not money printing. But as far as I'm concerned, it essentially amounts to the same thing. It's money creation. It's money creation out of thin air. And where does this leave the banks? Because if the banks are operating in that kind of environment, and maybe one shouldn't be blaming the banks too much, because it's the environment that's shaped them. They're just adapted themselves to a sort of constant stream of money that's been coming in their direction. I mean, it would be inevitable if, that was the environment that, they would in time sort of adapt to it. Not just banks, by the way, countries, governments, they've all operated in this system of incredibly loose money that's been going on and getting worse. Anyway, where does that leave the banks? I mean, I've heard rumors. I don't identify any bank, please, but I've heard rumors that there are some very, very big banks that are in real trouble, and that that there's at least $1 trillion bank that is on the edge. I mean, have you heard anything like that yourself? I mean,
have I heard anything like that myself?
Yeah,
are you kidding me? Yes. Of course I've heard things. I hear a lot of things all the time. And
yes.
What got me canceled was being a whistleblower and writing Planet Ponzi. Yeah. That's the problem, because it outlines and delineates, what happens. and what will happen when you print copious amounts of money. So, nothing has been fixed. This is the biggest problem that we have today. But there is a silver lining to all of this, because people are going to have an opportunity of a lifetime who understand how to guide their own finances and protect themselves and their families. And that's the really important takeaway for this, because there's going to be a lot of distressed assets for sale when everything collapses. And the problem is, people need to decide what they want. Will you accept authoritarianism, or will you accept fighting for freedom? And I think we need to fight for freedom. And this is a hill to die on now. And I think we're reaching a precipice to a really dark, dark, dark place. Because, look, people are telling us what they're telling you is not the truth. The banks are failing. And the politicians tell you one thing, they get elected, and then they do whatever they want, and they take payoffs to the highest bidder. I mean, basically, organizations, people like the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization, these are run by clowns. I mean, who are the people that run them? What background do they have? What authority do they have? They don't. They sell us out to the highest bidder. I mean, the highest bidder is Bill Gates in the WEF and WHO. I mean, he inserted the head of the WEF, pretty much Klaus, and Tedros in the WHO. So, as I said at the beginning of the program, we need our sovereignty, and we need our freedom, and we need to have leaders that represent and protect the people. We don't have that anymore. Somehow we've gone off the path, and they're off the reservation smoking some pipe with somebody with some crazy stuff in it. Maybe they spent too much time in Amsterdam or New York now.
Do you think politicians understand the situation? I mean, do you think people? I'm not talking about the president of the United States. Let's put him aside. But do you think someone like, Rishi Sunak in Britain or Olaf Scholz understand the nature of the economic situation, that they're really operating on a system that is absolutely dysfunctional and completely broken, or have they not grasped it? I remember you telling me, this is some time ago, that you went and had a discussion some years back with the British authorities, the British government, the political leaders, about the energy situation in Britain. And this was years ago. And you were explaining to them that we're going to have energy shortages looming in Britain at some point, because there's not sufficient investment being made in the energy infrastructure. And they simply didn't understand it. They didn't understand it then. Do you think they have any better understanding of things now?
Well, that was I was speaking to the head of DEFRA, and I actually met with Prince Charles and all of the people with climate change way back in the day. But I told the head of DEFRA back after deregulation of natural gas and energy, that with the amount of you're talking about when I discussed that the amount of electricity, natural gas that was coming offline, the power generators, British Energy was taking some nuclear power plants offline. If we didn't replace them with even more or equal power, we wouldn't meet demand 25 years from now, which would be like 2025 or 2026. We'd go dark. And they laughed at me and they said, "Oh no, don't worry about it." Basically they were saying it's not on our shift. We're not going to deal with that right now. So the problem is that the government, and under Blair and Brown, never replaced generation that was coming offline. And they didn't. And my white paper that I gave them discussed that you have an increasing population, and you're going to have an increase in demand for electricity, and you're taking more supply offline. So you're going to have massive imbalances. I said, you already have a dysfunctional grid. The national grid in the UK is dysfunctional. I said, that's one of the things that they needed to replace 26 years ago, or 25 years ago, 26 years ago. And they did nothing. So, and then now they're saying, oh, it's the climate crisis, and that's why we don't have any energy. No, this is assignment of blame. It's the usual blame game. Let's blame something else. Let's not talk about profligate spending. Do the politicians understand what they've done? I think that they have to understand what they've done, but whether they, I always had a view that politicians were a lot smarter than what they were, but I think you've got to say that a lot of them have the wrong advisors. Look, I ran for parliament in 2019, in the 2019 elections in the UK, right? So
I remember.
that was an eye opener for me, because when I did a husting, I was shocked at the politicians I was running against, the Labour Party and the Tory Party, about the money and the plans that they were going to spend. This was in December of 2019. I'll never forget it. And then it was my turn to speak. I said, well, I love your plans, guys, but how do you expect to pay for your programs? Because it's impossible for you to pay for this stuff, because our debt levels are already too high. And one of them said, oh, we're going to issue some bonds. I said, what, do you have any idea how capital markets work? And we got into a discussion about it. So no, they don't have any idea how capital markets work, A. And B, I was less than impressed with all of them. So I think they have the wrong advisors. And you can't go to the people that created the problem to come up with a solution. Now, Rishi wants to have plausible deniability that this was all Boris's fault or was Liz Truss's fault. And it wasn't. This is a systemic problem. I have a graph of sterling from 2008, when Merv the Swerve King started printing money like it was going out of style, and he bailed out the banks. You had sterling drop precipitously from 2.08 to the US dollar down to 140, or 141, or 138. That's a 34 decline. That's a currency devaluation. That stuff happens in third world countries, like the banana republic that the USSA is right now. But nobody said anything, and everybody's saying, "Oh well, the UK currency now collapsed under mistrust." So I'm saying the debt has kept increasing in the UK, and they have the same people that created the problem still in charge of the problem. And at 126, sterling has a long way to adjust to the downside still. So I'm very concerned about what's going to happen, because and that's part of the problem with supply chains, is the value of the currency goes down. It makes all prices and inflation go higher, right? So this is what I was talking about before. You need to look at the big macroeconomic picture, and too many people aren't looking at it. And you don't have anyone in the mainstream media that's a good commentator on the economy. They don't know what they're talking about. Sorry.
This is exactly a point, by the way, which a lot of people don't understand, which is that movements in currencies will cause inflation issues, particularly if the economy in question is that of an importer. Like in Britain, if you import manufactured goods and you import commodities, and you have to pay for them, and if you're paying for them in your own devalued currency, then your prices are going to rise. I mean, one thing follows another. The costs grow, and that is a major cause of inflation. It's been a problem with inflation in Britain for as long as I can remember, and it explains why British inflation rates tend to be higher than in those of other developed countries, because Britain has an excessively big import bill. This is at least my own personal view. What is going to happen eventually, Mitch? Are people going to lose confidence? Are markets going to lose confidence? Because you talk about a Ponzi scheme, but you always like to say, you say in your book, that you can't taper your way out of a Ponzi. Eventually, the money just isn't enough going in. And at some point, it just can't keep up with the demand for the money that goes out, at which point the whole thing sort of collapses on itself. How is that going to actually play out, in fact?
Well, I think you're going to have to see not a great reset, but you're going to see a series of systemic failures, and you're going to see bankruptcies, and you're going to see defaults. And that is now unavoidable due to the reckless policies of central banks. I mean, the model that you have to look at is, look at Japan. And let's talk about Japan for a minute. People think that Japan, can't impact our markets, but actually it can, because Japan has had a lost economy for over 3 decades, maybe going on 4 decades, when it's been stagnant. They had 2 sets of accounting books and positions there for the banks. One was an accrual-based accounting, and one was mark to market. Now, for people who don't understand that, mark to market means that if you have a table and you pay $100 for the table, that's worth, if you'll buy it from me for 100, That's mark to market because it's $100. I have a buyer at 100. Now, so if the price of that table, if inflation goes up and the price of that table goes up to $200, right? Then it's the price has doubled, but the value of your currency is not the same. So you can only buy half of a table for $100, right? Can, conversely, if you have an asset like a table and the price of the table goes down because nobody wants to buy the table, and the only person that wants to buy it is $25, you just lost 75%, right? So that's under mark to market. But what the banks did on bad assets, make believe that their loan book is a table at $100 and the value of their loans goes down to $25. So when you use accrual-based accounting, you can say, oh, our loans are worth $100 still because that's what we have outstanding, right? So it's accrual-based accounting they made after the credit crisis. They allowed that, which is accounting fraud in my world. So this is a big part of the problem, and people don't understand the difference. But the asset is only worth what somebody's willing to pay for it, if that makes sense to you. So I think now the problem that you're going to have is with all these real estate portfolios and everybody who's been speculating and buying buy to let, and now it's going to be buy to nothing because people, the buy to let properties and all the building. I mean, if you drive around central London and you see all those cranes and all the construction that's being built at the prices and the break evens that they're building these projects, I don't know who's going to buy this. I mean, I don't know who has the money to buy these. And then the banks lent money on them. So who's going to be on the hook? It's like musical chairs, but there's going to be probably 50,000 asses in about 4 chairs, right?
Which is exactly what did happen in Japan. I mean, I know people who were there, but I mean, there was exactly the same. There was a massive property construction boom in Japan in the late 1980s. And of course, it all imploded because people just couldn't afford the prices. I seem to remember that there was a point where the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were worth more than the state of California. I mean, it was that kind of crazy situation.
Yeah, I was there. Yeah, I was there as well.
Absolutely. You were there. You were there. And as I said, I mean, in Britain, in London, you go to London, you'll find construction everywhere. It is going on all the time. And it makes absolutely no sense relative to what is, to the spending power that people have. People constantly tell you spend your time in London. I cannot afford to buy any more, certainly property, because the prices are too high. So what is all this construction going to? It is very strange and very, very difficult to understand. So we're going to be there. We're going to be in a situation like Japan. We're going to have stagnation and perhaps recession as well. Except at least the Japanese have industries. We don't.
Right, but if you look at what's going on there now, what's happened is that the Bank of Japan, with their crazy policies under Kuroda, when Kuroda was running the Bank of Japan, if you go back and you look in 2015, I'll never forget this, and people should never forget this. You can find this on my Twitter feed somewhere. There's a picture of Kuroda looking at Peter Pan, and he was actually giving a speech. And he said, I'm basing some of my monetary policy on Peter Pan. When people believe you can fly, everything is fine. It's when people stop believing you can fly that you have a problem. Think about that for a minute. And I tell you that it's just unbelievable, the central banks. Now, what they've done is basically the central bank has printed tons of money, and they own most of the bonds in the bond market, or they've stuffed them into the postal system, which is pension funds in Japan. So there's a huge problem there, and they've kept artificially low interest rates for 35 or 40 years, negative interest rates. So I would argue, and I have been arguing for the past 5 years, that they're going to be an indicator of who falls first. Because if you watch their currency's been dropping precipitously, and it's hit decade new lows, and it's trading 134 to 137 range right now. But I think that's that's a short. I don't like the currency because, I've told people, I said, the Bank of Japan, and they have a new head of the Bank of Japan that said he's going to come out with even more he's a professor, which is dangerous when they put professors into the seat of they have no idea about what a real economy does or how banking works. But, they say, oh, academically, it worked fine. I can't imagine what could possibly go wrong. But so they had two options. They can either save the bond market by owning bonds and buying bonds, or save the currency. They can't do both. And I've never seen in my career, which spans over 4 decades, I've never seen foreign exchange intervention work, except recently when Russia came in, when the sanctions were put on them, and they said, we're going to back our currency by gold. But, their currency is not really actively traded outside of Russia. But backing the currency by gold, or backing it by physical, tangible assets, will be the way forward. And I don't know which country or combination of countries are going to come out with a basket of commodities that you can exchange the fiat for, but somebody will. And that's going to replace the US dollar in terms of the new world reserve currency.
Yeah, Mitch, we're in very, very interesting, turbulent times. I think we've been speaking for about an hour now, and we said we'd be about an hour. So I think this is perhaps where we'll end, but I think we'll need to come back and we'll talk about an awful lot more. Absolutely. Anything you wanted to add, Alex?
Mitch, we have quite a few questions that people have asked. Is it okay if I send you the questions, and maybe either maybe we schedule a show where, Mitch, you look at the questions?
I could answer a couple of them now.
Can you answer a couple?
Yeah,
how much time?
We could.
Okay, let's do. Do you have like 10, 15 minutes?
Okay, 10 minutes. Because if you send them to me, it adds to my inbox.
Yeah.
But people can find me on,
and let's knock these out.
Find me on Twitter.
Okay, let's go. Alex wants to know, compared to the 2008 financial crisis, how big is this going to be?
Multiples larger, and we need to find the people who allowed this to happen and hold them to account. Yeah, it's going to be multiples bigger.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. Let me go down here. Why does half the world want to turn China into a crater, yet they want their money? It makes no sense.
Well, I think that's I think what they're talking about with that one is I think that the United States has sold about $1.4 trillion worth of bonds to China. And I think people are concerned about how China's going to get their money back. And there's a lot of, this goes back to my argument or my discussion about multipolarity versus unipolarity and a rules-based order. And 85% of the people in the world who say, look, along with being ruled by the United States or being, a serf economy or debt serf to the United States, we want independence and we want our own sovereignty. And where we're going now with a war in Ukraine, we're trying. Are you guys still there?
Yeah, we hear you. Yeah. Okay. Continue.
Yeah. So they're ratcheting up wars on multi-fronts between Russia and between China. This is where we're in a dangerous spot right now. I don't think we should have any war, and I think people need to ratchet it down. And I said this, that the war in Ukraine could have been avoided, but Boris Johnson scuppered the whole deal, the peace deal that was going to be done in March of 2022. I mean, and that's what should have been done. And I don't know why they're getting away with it, because I would say 90% of the people are against what's going on in Ukraine right now, and they don't want to pay for it. It's just another 100 trillion, and 100 billion, hundreds of billions of dollars. It's going to end up being trillions of dollars. It's added to the taxpayer's bill, and I don't know why we should have to pick up this spending. I mean, think about the UK. What are we spending? HS2, 200 billion. The train to nowhere. I mean, 100 billion in wasted PPI, right? And I could think of close to 700 billion that the government's wasted, and this is because you have a lack of leadership and zero accountability. I mean, and they're never held to account. Same people, right?
Correct. Sparky says, wasn't it only the Icelandic bankers who went to prison for the 2008 crash?
Yeah, well, there's a chart in my book actually that basically zero bankers ever went to jail for the credit crisis, and I think that's a big part of the problem is the zero accountability. You know, the chart says 0, 0, 0 right across the board, and as Alan Greenspan said that I mentioned earlier, Alan Greenspan said that actual fraud was committed, and these people were never held to account. So if they get away with it once, we're going to get away with it all the time, and that's the problem we have today. Is people operate in a dual justice system and get away with crimes, financial crimes, and other crimes like selling influence, like the Biden family crime syndicate, and they're not prosecuted. And then you have prosecutors like in New York that just create their own laws to prosecute people. It's like Stalin's guy that said, "Look, find me the man, and I'll find you the crime. Or I'll create the crime, whatever it is."
What does Mitch think about the Basel II regulations encouraging banks to proliferate credit default swaps as part of synthetic secularization to reduce risk weighting and balance sheet assets, resulting in the 2006-07 subprime crisis?
I mean, look, I don't know that Basel II is going to be a good thing or actually going to be a game changer. What I think they need to do is look at the existing regulations and a lot of the products that these non-recourse loans that they have out there. I mean, there's so many games going on with derivative products that they need to actually look into that they haven't, and they need to understand where the counterparty risks are, which was one of my pet peeves with them, the way they handled the 2008 crisis. They still don't understand how counterparty risk works. Because if one counterparty has exposures, you need to know that, and they can't identify that because no bank is going to tell you what's on their balance sheet or what's off their balance sheet. And those are the real risks that we have in the financial stability and financial system. They can come up with a lot of things, but until you have regulators that understand what the actual risk is and can identify the risks, you can't have a financial system that's functional for the long term.
Right. Let's do one or two more, Mitch, and we will wrap up. As a Westerner, I believe in the West and want to see us succeed. Yet we are failing, led into financial, economic, military, and moral ruin by our leaders, to the applause of much of our own population and foes. It breaks my heart. That's from Brent.
Yeah, I mean it's a sad story. Of course, I want to see things work out for the West as well. And I've been trying to impact change, and I want us to have the positive change that's going to make everybody happy and families happy and have the money that they need to put their kids in the schools they want. And I don't want to see cultural Marxism take over. But what's happened, as I mentioned earlier, is we don't have pregnant men. What we have is we have the destruction of traditional ideas, norms, values, and institutions in the nuclear family. This is an assault on the majority, and a shrieking little minority has a disproportionate amount of influence over policy. And I think this was intended to create division and tribalism while the biggest plunder goes on in the background. And I think that we need to stand up and speak out about all of this. We need leaders, not liars. And now we have liars, and that's going to always end badly.
All right. And let's end it with Russell Hall, who says, I don't dispute the idea of commodity-backed currency, but being a reserve would make it subject to the same vulnerabilities as the dollar and worse.
Yeah, well, I don't know that it would be subject to the same vulnerability as a dollar, because I don't think that you'd be able to leverage it as much. And I think what's happened is that the U.S. dollar has just been printed and printed and printed. So if you don't have a commodity backing, you can't exchange it. What is you have to talk about what a currency is. And if you look at any U.S. note, it says this is a promissory note. So the currency, what is a currency? It's a promise of the government to repay its debt. And if the debt in the United States is the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, because as interest rates go up versus their revenues, they can't even pay the interest on their loans, they're going to default. They're going to default. But if you have a currency that's backed by something, give me oil, give me copper, give me silver, give me gold, whatever it's backed by, you have to provide that. Otherwise, your currency is worthless. But fiat currency is backed by nothing other than a promise to repay. And at this point, I think it's a very risky proposition that the U.S. can ever repay the amount of debt that they have, especially as interest rates go higher, which they have to if we're going to fight inflation.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, let's end it there. Mitch, I have your information in the description box down below. Planet Ponzi, Twitter, and I will add the Substack as well, and it will be as a pinned comment as well. Mitch Feierstein, thank you very, very much for a fantastic hour plus hour 15 minutes.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. I had a really good time.
Great to have you here, Mitch. Alexander Mercouris in London. Thank you to everyone that was watching us on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, theduran.locals.com, and YouTube. And thank you to all our moderators, Valies, Peter, Reckless Abandon, and everybody else that was moderating. I hope I didn't miss anybody. Take care and have a great morning, afternoon, or evening.